Let's introduce our next speaker. He's joining us on Zoom and is willing to talk about it. He's a writer, professor, poet, and storyteller who helps people understand the history of racist America, especially in the South. He's written powerful books and believes in speaking the truth, even it's hard. He is also the president of 16,000-member Authors Guild. Mr. W. Ralph Eubanks. Welcome to Buffalo, New York.
Well, I'm really happy to be with all of you today and kind of talk a bit about book banning. And as you said in your very kind introduction, I do write about the South, and that is primarily what I do as a writer and as a university professor. And thinking about book banning, someone who is from the South to my native Southern ears was where book banning evoke a flood of historical facts and memories. So they take me back to my childhood in the Jim Crow South, where resistance to the forces of integration led to books being labeled as dangerous. And I also have to say there was the purging of certain books from school libraries. There were also bans on certain publications actually coming into the state of Mississippi during the Civil Rights Movement. And as historian C. Van Woodward observed about the same time in American history, said politicians who had once spoken for moderation began to vie with each other in defiance of the government. I'm also reminded that during my high school years in the 1970s, I had a teacher who suggested taking away my copy of Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf because, based on the cover, it held the words, one of the most famous and daring novels of the 20th century. I wanted to take it away because it didn't seem like a book that would be giving me the right ideas. And that threat only made me more defiant and led me to read other books that many of my teachers would have deemed as dangerous. As I mentioned, as you mentioned in the introduction, I teach at the University of Mississippi. And in 1964, a University of Mississippi professor by the name of James Silver wrote a book about the ways my home state sought to isolate itself from ideas outside its borders. And it was called Mississippi, the Closed Society. And it was published in the wake of the murders of 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi in 1964. And the publication of this book led to threats on James Silver's life and forced Mr. Silver to leave the university. Now, today, as you enter the gates to the campus of the University of Mississippi, there is a body of water named Silver Pond, dedicated to James Silver's memory. It is a physical reminder of the way the freedom to write and read can be encroached upon. And it's a place I often tell my students about because they pass by daily and they don't really know the significance of James Silver's name. Now that I teach at this university, which is also my undergraduate alma mater, I think of James Silver every day as I pass that pond, since it reminds me of how the past really lives in very close proximity to the present. All of the issues that James Silver confronted, censorship and book bans, are still very much with us. And they are issues that are important to me as both a writer and as the president of the Authors Guild. Now, as a university professor, I see what I do as educating the next generation of writers and scholars. Now, not every one of my students will become a writer or academic, but I like to think that when I talk with students about my work, that they will be inspired to pursue a life of the mind in whatever path they choose in the future. Yet, I don't see what I'm doing as really changing hearts and minds. All I really ask for those who enter the doors of my classroom is to think for themselves and recognize the ways that the past really does live on in the present. And if my students are restricted from certain stories of the Southern past in my classes on Southern Studies, I also feel that they are being robbed of a full and robust educational experience. But the place where you are concerned about book bans now is not the South. It is far above the Mason-Dixon line in New York State, in the town of Buffalo, a place that some of my relatives from the South went in order to escape the constraints of Jim Crow. It's almost a cliche to say that we live in perilous times. But I also believe that if we use history as a guide, maybe we can find a way through a period in our history that increasingly reminds me of my formative years in the American South. I have come to realize that by setting the South apart and marginalizing it as a part of the American psyche, we as a society have for far too long neglected the power and magnetism of the region's cultural and political reach. My work as a writer has explored the silences of the Southern past and how they affected us all as Americans. Today, I think we're all living with one foot in the Old South, whether we want to admit it or not. But by recognizing the link the book bans of the present have to those of the past, I think we can begin to see the historical absurdity of what is really happening to us today. Just 2 years ago, I took part in the Mississippi Banned Books Festival, which had the theme Erasing Memory. And at that festival, I was in conversation with two great Mississippi writers, Kiese Lehman and Jessamine Ward. And we began by talking about how they felt when they heard their books had been banned. Kiese and Jessamine both felt they were in very good company with other Black writers like Maya Angelou and Toni Morrison. But what I remember mostly is the shock that Jessamine Ward felt when she learned her book was banned. There was genuine hurt that day she had difficulty expressing. And we also talked about the idea of memory. Now, when I talk about memory, this idea of memory, I think of the ways that we as a society recall, lay claim to, understand, and represent the past. So really to understand, lay claim to, and represent the past. By untying our link to the past, by banning books that depict that past accurately, we are also reshaping our present. And at that book festival, I asked Kiese and Jessamine why people feel the need to reshape the past. Kiese responded by saying he thought if we ground this perspective of a 12-year-old child and tell them they can't read a writer like Toni Morrison or Jessamine Ward, that we are actually doing harm to that child's foundation of understanding the past. And that is because Kiese feels that Toni and Jessamine Ward are two of the best chroniclers of memory in the pantheon of American writers. And he said that 12-year-old needs to learn from writers who have actively engaged with historical memory. And Jessamine Ward interjected that day that she thought the need to reshape the past and the future through book bans is fueled by shame. Books by Black writers often reckon with brutal aspects of our past and our present. And these are truths that many people don't want to confront. Consequently, what they do is they ban books so they don't have to feel shame about the ways Black freedom was constrained in the past. Now, I sincerely believe history and memory inform each other and lead us to truth. And truth comes about in our society by virtue of multiple forms of constraint and balance. But why, in this particular moment, is our society so invested in what might be described as negative constraint? I think it's so that we can maintain a solitary worldview that keeps out anything negative and also shields us from the realities of our history. And I don't think that is healthy. Now, my stand against book banning comes about not just because I'm the president of the Authors Guild. I feel this way because, of course, I know what it's like to have certain materials cordoned off and deemed as dangerous. And I have to say, I also know how important it is to understand the realities of history, particularly civil rights history, which for me is lived experience. I was born in 1957, really just 2 years after the murder of Emmett Till in Mississippi, an event that launched the civil rights movement. And Consequently, I find it puzzling that there's now a need to shield people from the harsh realities of what is part of my living memory. Now, in her masterful memoir, Men We Reap, Jessamine Ward observed this. She said, "Life is a hurricane, and we board up to save what we can and bow low to the earth to crouch in that small space above the dirt where the wind will not reach." As Americans today, we are in the middle of a hurricane. New York State and all states of our great country must do whatever they can to advocate for the rights of readers to seek truth and understand the past. Limiting access to books will not shield young people's exposure to difficult topics. Young people's natural curiosity will push them toward difficult material. In our legal advocacy to end book banning across the country, the Authors Guild seeks to protect the integrity of writers as well as access to the written word, which is what I think you are both working for today. And I'm happy to stand with you today as a fellow citizen on this issue.